The report, let me just come back to it. The report kind of confirms our worst fears. I think we all know that things aren't very good with the service, where we understand that the performance is poor. We understand that the transparency is an issue, that absolutely. Now the question is, there are, not the question, the fact is that there are some parameters that the TRAI has identified and which clearly seem to be observed more in their breach, as your report seems to be suggesting. Now, I think the issue really is, what do you do with it, right? Now, my sense is that a problem of this scale cannot be resolved by something which is pretty much unenforceable. Now, the truth is that the quality of service will not only, you'll have to talk about the quality of service experience of only close to 1 billion, or let's say 500 million consumers. Now that is not something you can do, and I think the point that Raymond has also made, did I get it right? Yeah. Raymond has made is correct, that eventually we will have to look for market mechanisms to deal with this. I think we also need to recognize, and I think the point that both Vikram as well as Shyam have made, that really I don't see any reason why the telecom operator would find it commercially unattractive to deal with the quality of service. It's not as if his incentives are aligned with the poor quality of service. They aren't, right? Now, so the question really then becomes as to how do you design a quality of service regulation? And that is not a trivial thing. The fact is, the world over, where quality of service is good, is not because quality of service regulation or quality of service parameters have been identified and are being observed and are being tested, etc. It's happening in spite of all that. It's happening because there is either a very competitive market, or the consumer itself will not accept a certain and of course in many other developed countries the consumer is also spoiled. The consumer has his home experience to compare with. So I think for a mobile operator in, say, any of the developed world, to offer a service as poor as you think this service is, would be extremely difficult, given what an average home user or average business user is currently able to experience in there. So I think the markets are responding different. Now, I think the other point is that we have to be clear whether, given these spectrum resources, given the many other constraints that Vikram is talking about, the fact remains that the quality of service, while we will assume that it is the problem that the operator has kind of created, the fact remains that there are several steps. He's just one of the cogs in that wheel. He's one of the links in that chain. So that is something that we cannot do anything more than align incentives, in my view. That we have to create a set of incentives, and that's where Raymond is also sort of suggesting that we have to allow consumers to vote with their feet. Now, the TRAI has done some things right after having done things very badly wrong, in my view. I think the whole approach to the penalties that was proposed was problematic, because it was virtually unenforceable. And also the fact remains that it was so much prone to abuse as well. Because I know, for example, even in my own house, and you know it in yours as well as in your office, that this part has better service, better coverage than that, my roof has better coverage than my veranda, and so on and so forth. Now, for a penalty-based system to work in those circumstances would be a travesty. And I think it wouldn't have served any purpose. And I think so what is my point here? I think now that the TRAI is doing some amount of crowdsourced data collection, it's doing various other kind of analytics, I think one place where both individuals as well as businesses could be helped by is if we had sufficient number of applications on the using this basic data to tell you for example, one point that never came through in this discussion is that for a mobile service, you're not talking about quality of service at a place. You don't consume mobile services only at one place. If my service at home is good and my service at the office is bad, then there is a problem. So some of these applications probably would be such where you could probably feed in, half a dozen places that you normally frequent. And based on that, they could come up and give you, that they could actually provide you some kind of some kind of a number, some kind of an approach to what you would be best subscribing to, which operator is good for you, which plan is good for you, etc. Now that is where I think the problem is, and I think in some ways that is where the TRAI itself must be focusing. I think where TRAI has done good work in some of this stuff, but where it still lacks, I think, is creating, making it easy for the average user to actually use these parameters, or based on these parameters to take rational decisions. Because that is something that, for instance, I would have thought that the TRAI's website and TRAI's this would have a lot of stuff on what your handset is or is not capable of doing. Right? For instance, it would be great if you could go to the TRAI website and say, look, what should I be conscious of when I'm buying a second-hand handset? What is the trade-off if I buy a cheap handset versus a more expensive one? Am I actually getting quality, or am I just getting a sexy handset by paying more? Whatever. Now, all those things are issues of great consumer interest, and those are things that the TRAI could actually assist, because the kind of information, both the kind of parameters that the TRAI has set, the kind of data that is available on the TRAI website, are both unusable by the average user. And that intermediation is something that the TRAI must facilitate, in my view.
Unusable, that's
Sorry?
Unusable.
Well, unusable by the average user. Fair enough. No, I take your point. I don't mean it in technically unusable. Clearly it is usable. It's very high quality data in many cases. So my point is not about the quality of the data, but the kind of intermediation that you need to do to make it accessible to people who need to make these real life decisions. So the last point I'm making is again the point that Shyam has also made, is that really we must recognize that our own licensing as well as the spectrum management is now a very important barrier to improving the quality of service and the broadband experience. Now, if the kind of solutions we are talking about, particularly in the sub-gigahertz space, are available, we will have to do something about our spectrum auctions. We will have to come up with a creative solution to how we will allocate the spectrum. The current rules that we have are certainly working against us. The same thing, for instance, another place where the MVNOs could have been of great importance in this whole quality of service space, because they could actually have provided customized solutions. They could have actually dealt with places which are historically or which are geographically more problematic. An MVNO could have been a perfect solution for something like that. But again, we have created immense costs for getting an MVNO license. We have created huge compliance challenges. And I think the whole approach of revenue sharing that we follow, which seemed like a brilliant idea 20 years ago, and I was a part of the part of the group that actually advocated it 20 years. Now it has run full circle. I think now it has become a big liability, because now that same revenue sharing this thing has now got our exchequer very well to taste blood. And now we're just unable to even, because the Telegraph Act requires anybody providing any kind of telecommunication service to have a license, and because every license should then come with a revenue sharing and should then also have spectrum that is auctioned, blah, blah, blah. All those things, instead of freeing up the market instead of creating incentives for people to invest, creating people to innovate, are actually coming in the way of